It keeps getting harder and harder. Actually, it keeps getting easier and easier. Hi. Thank you all for coming and putting up with a very long day. Good, we're on. I'm coordinating two things here, so let's see if this works. So thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Megan, for inviting me back here. And I actually had another title for this talk. And I promised that it would be fair and balanced on both sides specifically being Google and the press. But I do wager that you'll all be convinced about this in the next 20 minutes from right now. So it's hard to be at any conference or seminar or cocktail party, particularly in San Francisco or New York these days, without the topic of Google Glass coming up. It's been about as polarized and volatile as anything I've seen in my career, at least in terms of a consumer item. And my particular concern is how bad communication right now between Google and the press can result in big mistakes that are often avoidable mistakes. The vision is pretty clear and it's pretty inevitable as we move from mainframe. You know, I am old enough that when I was an undergrad, computing meant punch cards and mainframes. But wearables, whether they're glass or other things, is really inevitable. We know that. Google Glass is brilliant. It's a brilliant first pass. They're super well designed. They're very cool. I've tried on a prototype. They're not immersive VR. They're above the eye to allow eye contact, and a friend of mine on the team actually used the word spiritual, and I thought that was kind of interesting in terms of what they are trying to do. The screen is currently said to be only 640 by 360 pixels, so it's small, and they're telling developers to think headlines. Now, I know this sounds like a lot, taking 1,000 pictures a day, and I'll probably live this down. Does anybody remember these? This is an analog laserdisc, and in 1978, MIT received one of the first prototypes, and it can hold a half an hour of analog video on each side, and a half an hour, 30 frames per second is 54,000 frames, all of which can be computer accessed. So it seemed like an enormous number, and we made one of the first ever all-slide. We basically copied the MIT Art and Architecture Library. Nothing like that had ever been done. We called it the Slide-a-thon. I was a student. I directed production. We could only work from Friday at 6 p.m. to Monday at 9 a.m. nonstop. I bet the lab director, Nicholas Negroponte, that we could do it in 2 weekends. I lost, but just by a few hours. But the point is, at the time, we thought that 54,000 pictures was a virtual infinity. There was something amazing about Flickr. There still is, but it's something about its open-ended free-for-all. The word folksonomic came up, was essentially invented around Flickr. And today there are about 6 billion images on Flickr. I found this on the Internet Archive. This is their original homepage from 2004. And a blog by one of the co-founders, Katerina, where she's saying, look at the tags we found. A frog, how quaint. And today there's over 200,000 hits when you look at frogs. And when you have such giant numbers, you can get into much more interesting and complicated tags like cats and sinks and circles and squares and blue. This is a SIGGRAPH paper given by some researchers at Carnegie Mellon several years ago. Again, when you have such an enormous database of photos, you can kind of fill in anything you need, and this is done automatically. An increasing number of photos are being geotagged, either by hand or by the EXIF protocol in cameras. As of 2010, there were 140 million geotagged images in Flickr, 20 million in Panoramio, but these numbers are nothing. Now, this came out last week. This is Mary Meeker's internet trends that she does every year at the All Things D conference. And 500 million uploads and shares a day. And you can see that right now most of it is Facebook, but these numbers are going to skyrocket even higher with wearable cameras. And I'll give you an example. A couple weeks ago, I was in San Francisco walking down a residential street, no cars, and it was on a hill. And in front of me, there were two couples on both sides of the street with kids walking back and forth across the street. And right behind them, maybe 3 meters, there was a homeless man, it was garbage day, going through to collect bottles. And I thought, this is a keeper, this is a picture, just like that. Something stopped me. You know, it's like the act of reaching in and pulling out my iPhone and taking the photo. I don't know if it was the effort, or I chickened out, or it was just going to take too long. But if I was wearing glass, I'd just do it like that. There's no question about it. With billions of images, we're going to start seeing a blur between what today we call still images, movies, and 3D models. Some of you may recognize this. This is Dealey Plaza, Dallas, the site of the JFK assassination. And in addition to the famous Zapruder film, there are several hundred known still photographs and several additional films. And for years, people have talked about, and they use the word dimensionalize, put it all together. And finally, a few years ago, the Discovery Channel did this. Now, to do this, especially 4 or 5 years ago, really is a labor of love. This all has to be done by hand and trying to figure out where the cameras were. But in a moment, you'll see how they put everything together, and that watch for seamlessness and how close the images can match, taken by totally different people, like that. Now, of course, this is 1963, and only a few hundred photos and a few films. I still get the creeps when I see this, you know. Okay, so a colleague of mine came up with the phrase, 1,000 Zapruders, and those days are over. And it's going to be more like thousands and thousands or millions of Zapruders at practically any event going forward. Here's a project that I coordinated at USC a couple years ago called Viewfinder, and the idea is to combine the folksonomic free-for-all of Flickr with the visceral feeling of flying around that you get in Google Earth. And the trick is to have these photos perfectly spatially aligned. So I'll just play a little bit of this video. We got a Google research grant to do some of this work, and we knew that everybody else was working on building 3D models from photos. We were interested in respecting the integrity of your photo and having it aligned. And you can imagine that if it's not perfectly aligned, it's not cool and it doesn't work. And if it is aligned, it's magic. And these could be historical photos. Again, we wanted to open it up to be any kind of photo at all. A related project that actually Marix just showed is from the University of Washington. Now, the little black sideways pyramids are the photos that have been splatted out together in computer 3 space to automatically make this model of Dubrovnik. So these are two complementary approaches. One is using photos to make 3D models, and the other is using pre-existing 3D models to spatially situate your photos so that they appear magically aligned. The idea of a One Earth model is inevitable. And this is actually what my workshop tomorrow is going to be about, if anyone's interested. But there is a dark side. I inadvertently found myself exploring shortly after 9/11/2001, when I had an artist residency in a small city, Gifu, Japan. I became obsessed wondering whether it's possible to stop the gaze of a camera. The answer is yes, with these cheap little pocket lasers, these laser pointers. And if you aim it right, it'll knock out a camera. temporarily do no damage, but it's hard to aim it. In the United States, we can buy stuff like this readily, unfortunately. So here's at 100 yards. Excuse me. And things got a little out of control in Japan. Buying bigger and bigger ones. This is at 200 yards. I burned my artist residency studying camera zapping and published everything I knew online. And shortly after, the New York Times did a story on it, and they posted my website. I received 600,000 some hits in 2 days and lots of emails. Some, you know, you never can tell, but I would call them purported death threats. Ironically, my conclusion in this work is that anybody that does want to hide a camera can hide a camera, but the lesson is that cameras are very sensitive issues and people care a lot about cameras. So I'd like to tell a recent story. It happened earlier this year. You're probably all familiar with Street View, the camera cars that Google uses, and many of you may be familiar with the so-called Wi-Fi scandal that they got involved in 2010, collecting payload data. And they said it was a mistake, they screwed up, they said it was a rogue engineer, they said teams not talking with each other. It turned out to be a very expensive mistake, and investigations are still ongoing in a bunch of countries, and it's a very serious issue, and I don't want to get into that. This story is a bit lighter. Like many stories these days, it began with a tweet. So again, this is January of this year. I think Google Street View ran over a donkey in Botswana. They had just released the Botswana footage, the second country that they have shot in Africa. So if you go backward and forward through the camera, note the dust, and back to this, and in the other direction, the donkey is standing. So, you know, there are two explanations here. Either the donkey was lying down and got up when the car approached, or, well, you get the rest. Within hours, the story went viral. This is actually from here, and you'll notice that an Australian zoologist said, donkeys can't walk backwards like that. And again, it went viral. The New York Daily News published this picture with a caption showing the donkey on its side in the tracks. This was also heavily picked up, including by Al Jazeera. I mean, this really did go around. So what happened next? First, we have to review some basics. This photo was taken over 30 years ago, an MIT project called the Aspen Movie Map, cameras on top of a car. The bike wheel was to trigger the cameras by distance. So it's like movies, but it's triggered by distance rather than time. We filmed one frame every 10 feet, which is why it looks like this. And you can, of course, go forward and backward. We had to film going through every intersection, every possible way. And I guess more than anybody else, I spent the next 15 years continuing to do projects like this. So this one is for the Exploratorium in San Francisco using a gyro-stabilized camera. And the intention was to give a tight linked feeling rather than a helicopter experience, more like a Superman, Superwoman experience like this. Several years later, in Karlsruhe, the Center for Arts and Media commissioned a related project. They're very proud of their tram system. It was an opportunity to use a very large screen, so you felt more viscerally attached, and the rails afforded very, very stable imagery that looks almost computer graphic-like. But it was still 2D, and several years later I had the opportunity to do a 3D version using two cameras for left and right. There's an encoder on the wheel again, and packaging it in a turn-of-the-century kinetoscope because we needed the eye hood to give you the left-right stereoscopy, and the crank, like the trackball you saw on the Exploratorium, you really felt like there was film inside this thing. We got the optics pretty good. So it's 3D, it's wide angle, you turn the crank, you move backward and forward at really pretty fast speeds. A related project a few years later called Be Now Here was done in conjunction with the UNESCO World Heritage Center, going to endangered sites around the world with this contraption, a stereoscopic camera set that slowly rotates, and the image appears to be rotating around the audience. It gives a strong sense of panoramic immersion. What I'm not telling you is that the floor rotates, and that's how you get a sense that it's you really feel like it's rotating around you. So Street View basics. Cameras are triggered by distance rather than time. Movement can go in either direction. Total immersion is a nice addition, like the panoramic thing. And in my case, at least, you get to deal with all sorts of very colorful and dicey folks, the last being to bribe my driver out of jail, who the Army put him in. Okay, so now, let's get back to the donkey. So within 24 hours, Google issued a statement. Now, I'm no expert in this, but I don't think you want to fuck with donkeys in Botswana. They made it cute. They published some images. They did not address the zoologist's claim about donkeys walking backward. They mentioned that the dust is probably from the donkey taking a dust bath. And how convincing was this? This is actually a Google search from a couple days ago. Remember, this all just happened this year. And, you know, it looks like most folks weren't really convinced. And again, they didn't address the main sort of concerns. And, you know, how good is it when everybody's saying, you know, Google denies killing a donkey? It's like Nixon saying, I'm not a crook. And, you know, especially as they move into more and more remote countries. If Google explained, and if the press understood distance triggering, it would have known that the car would have stopped and waited for the donkey to move to the side. If Google explained, and the press understood, that camera cars can't see underneath, but have to complete the lower panorama by cleverly using parts from adjacent frames, it would realize that this is an artificially composited image. By the way, look at it. Duh. And regarding the dust, this is something that took me only a few minutes to make. This is nothing but straight Street View footage. And again, straight Street View footage, just close up. Okay, so it's pretty clear what happened. And of course, I'm not the only person that flagged this, but for the most part, the press didn't, Google never addressed it. So you can see why my original title really had this in, and everybody did miss, almost everybody missed what was going on, and there is a word in this title, the original title, that is troubling. So who is responsible for the push and pull of information over misinformation? The press and the blogging community really need to understand better the technologies that they're writing about. Google's done a remarkable engineering job, but they may wish to take a stronger creative leadership role on the less technical, more social and cultural front for Google Glass to be a success. Thank you.